The dress still existed. Vivienne had never burned it, never sold it, never let the moths take it. It hung in the back of the wardrobe in her small cottage bedroom, behind her winter coats, behind a wool shawl she never wore. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She simply knew it was there, the way one knows about an old wound that no longer bleeds but never quite disappears either. It was a Tuesday morning in October when the knock came. Not a servant's knock, not the postman's practiced rhythm, something slower, heavier, the kind of knock made by a hand that had rehearsed the gesture 100 times and still wasn't sure it was doing the right thing. Vivienne set down her teacup. She smoothed her apron. She told herself it was probably Mr. Alcott from next door, come again about the fence. She opened the door. The man standing in the rain was not Mr. Alcott. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply spent 10 years shrinking the memory of him down to something she could manage. His coat was soaked through. His hat was in his hands, turning slowly, the way guilty men hold things when they don't know what to do with their hands. His hair was darker with the rain. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in several weeks. He looked like a man who had something to say, and had forgotten every word of it. Edmund, the Duke of Ashford, the most sought-after man in 3 counties, the man who had promised her forever in a garden in June, with fireflies in the hedges and her father's brandy on his breath, and his hands shaking slightly when he took hers. The man who had not come. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I know," he said finally, "that I have no right to be here." Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. The rain came down steadily between them. A carriage passed on the lane behind him, splashing mud. Neither of them moved. Then she said very quietly, "No, you don't." And she did not close the door. Not yet. 10 years earlier. The summer of 1843 was the kind that people in England speak about for decades afterward. The one that actually arrived, warm and generous and almost embarrassingly beautiful, as though the sky had decided to make up for years of disappointment all at once. It was the summer Vivienne Ashby turned 22. It was the summer she wore her mother's pearl earrings for the first time. And it was the summer Edmund Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Ashford, told her that he intended to marry her, not as a question, not quite, but in that particular way of his, low and certain, as though he were simply stating a fact about the world that others had not yet caught up to. They had met at the Hargrove Ball in March, which Vivienne had attended with considerable reluctance, an address that was 2 seasons behind. She was a general's daughter, respectable enough to receive an invitation, but not quite enough to be placed near the windows where the important families gathered. She knew this. She had made her peace with it. She found a chair near the bookcase in the 2nd sitting room, and spent the better part of an hour reading the spines of books she could not reach, composing small private opinions about the people who owned them. "You're doing it wrong," said a voice beside her. She turned. A man she didn't recognize, tall, dark-coated, with the particular posture of someone who had grown up being looked at and found it neither pleasant nor useful. "I beg your pardon." "The Hargroves' library." He nodded toward the shelves. "They arrange them by color, not subject. Don't try to make sense of it. I spent 20 minutes here at Christmas looking for Locke and found him between a book on orchid cultivation and someone's Italian grammar." Vivienne looked at the shelves again. He was right. The books were arranged by color. She had been trying to read logic into the order and finding none. "That's absurd," she said. "It is," he agreed pleasantly. "Edmund Cavendish." She told him her name. He didn't react to it the way men sometimes did, scanning briefly for the family connection, the dowry potential, the social coordinates. He simply nodded as though her name were a satisfactory piece of information, complete in itself. They talked for 40 minutes. About books, mostly. about the particular cruelty of hostesses who put interesting people near the bookcase and dull people near the windows, about a paper she had read on the excavations at Pompeii, which he had also read and found wanting in 3 specific ways. When Lady Morehouse appeared at his elbow with a determined smile and a niece to introduce, Edmund excused himself politely. But before he turned away, he said, quietly, in a tone that was not quite meant for anyone else, "I hope you'll be at the Ashford dinner next month." She was. And the month after that. And the one after that. By July, London had noticed. London always noticed. It was, in Vivienne's experience, the city's primary occupation, noticing things about other people and constructing elaborate narratives about what those things meant. The narrative it constructed about Vivienne Ashby and the Duke of Ashford was not kind. She was after his title. She had trapped him somehow. She was pretty enough, yes, but pretty enough for Ashford. His mother, the formidable Duchess Helena, had reportedly said at a tea in Belgravia that her son was simply being charitable, that the girl had no mother, that Edmund had always had an unfortunate tendency towards sympathy. Vivienne heard these things. One always did. Edmund heard them too. One evening in late July, they were walking in the garden at a house party in Surrey, the kind of walk that required a chaperone but had somehow, gradually, involved leaving the chaperone significantly behind. The fireflies were beginning. The hedges smelled of something sweet that Vivienne couldn't name. Edmund stopped walking. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it before I say anything else." She turned to face him. His expression was unusually serious, not unhappy, but stripped of the dry humor he usually wore like a comfortable coat. "I am aware," he said, "of what is being said. I want you to know that I am also aware that it is being said in houses where my mother has recently taken tea." He paused. "I don't say this to alarm you. I say it so you know that I am not unaware of what I am doing." Vivienne's heart was doing something inconvenient. She kept her voice steady. "And what are you doing, Your Grace?" He looked at her for a moment. "I should like," he said, "to ask your father for permission to call on you formally, if you are willing." The fireflies rose around them in the warm July dark. Behind them, at a considerable distance, her chaperone Mrs. Gill could be heard offering opinions on the Surrey roses to anyone who would listen. Vivienne said, "I am willing." He had smiled then, a real one, not the polished social expression he wore in ballrooms, but the other one, the slightly unguarded one she had catalogued carefully over the previous months as the one that meant he was actually pleased. He offered her his arm and they walked back toward the lights of the house, and she was careful to keep her face composed because she was 22 years old and she did not want him to see quite how completely her hands were shaking. The engagement was announced in September. The wedding was set for the 14th of March. And Vivienne Ashby, General's daughter, 2 seasons behind dress, wrong side of the room, began, cautiously, to believe that the summer of 1843 was going to change everything. She was not wrong about that. She was only wrong about how. The 14th of March arrived the way important days often do, quietly, without ceremony, as though the world had not been informed of its significance. Vivienne was awake before dawn. She lay still for a while in the gray dark of her childhood bedroom, listening to the house wake up around her. The cook downstairs, a door somewhere, her father's footsteps in the hall, heavier than usual, which meant he had slept poorly. She stared at the ceiling and took careful inventory of herself, her breathing, her heartbeat, the particular quality of the silence, and found that she was not afraid. She was something else entirely, something that had no good name. A feeling like standing at the edge of a very high cliff, not with the intention of falling, but simply aware, in every nerve of the distance below. She rose, she washed, she sat at her mirror. Her maid, a quiet girl named Polly who had been with the family since Vivienne was 12, dressed her hair without speaking. This was a kindness. Polly had a gift for understanding when silence was more useful than words, and this morning she worked with a concentration that was almost devotional, pinning, smoothing, adjusting, until Vivienne's hair was everything it was supposed to be. Then came the dress. It had been made by a dressmaker in Bond Street. Edmund had insisted quietly, without making a production of it, in the way he handled most things he felt strongly about. Ivory silk, not white. A neckline that was modest but not severe. No excessive ornamentation. He had said when she described the design she was considering, "Whatever makes you feel most like yourself, that's the one." She had thought about that for a long time afterward. Whatever makes you feel most like yourself. As though that were the only criterion that mattered. Polly fastened the last button at the back of her neck and stepped away. Vivienne looked at her reflection. A woman she almost recognized looked back at her, composed, pale, wearing ivory silk in the thin March light. "You look beautiful, miss," Polly said. Vivienne smiled. "Thank you, Polly." Her father appeared in the doorway. He was dressed formally, gloved, hat in hand, everything correct. He looked at her, and something moved across his face that was gone too quickly for her to read. "The carriages are ready," he said. The church was St. George's in Hanover Square. Of course it was St. George's. Edmund's family had been married at St. George's for 4 generations. The pews would be full, his side overflowing with titles and connections, her side considerably thinner but respectable. She had made peace with the asymmetry. She had made peace with a great many things. They arrived at 10:30. The wedding was called for 11. Vivienne waited in the small vestibule to the side of the nave where brides waited. It smelled of cold stone and candle wax and flowers. Someone had arranged white roses along the window ledges, and their scent was almost too sweet in the enclosed space. She could hear the murmur of guests beyond the door, the organ beginning, stopping, beginning again. 11 o'clock came. She adjusted her gloves. The door did not open. 11:15. She heard the murmuring change quality, a subtle shift, like weather turning. The particular sound of a room full of people becoming uncertain. Her father appeared from somewhere. He would not look at her directly. "There may be a delay," he said. "These things happen." He said it to the floor. 11:30. The roses were very bright against the gray stone walls. Vivienne focused on them. She counted them. She had always had a talent for making herself very still when stillness was the only thing available to her. Her mother had called it composure. Her father had called it stubbornness. She had never decided which was more accurate. 11:45. The murmuring beyond the door was no longer trying to disguise itself. She could hear individual voices now, though not words. She heard a woman laugh, a nervous, inappropriate laugh, the kind that escapes when people don't know what else to do. Noon. The vestibule door opened. Not the main door, the side door, the servant's entrance. A young man in Ashford livery stepped in, hat crushed in his hands, face arranged in an expression of profound misery. He was perhaps 17. He looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. He held out a folded note. Vivienne looked at it for a moment before she took it. The handwriting was not Edmund's. She knew Edmund's handwriting. She had a small collection of his letters in a box in her bedroom, read often enough that she could reproduce the particular slant of his letters from memory. This was someone else's hand, careful, formal, the penmanship of a professional. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, regrets that he is unable to attend the ceremony today. He extends his sincerest apologies for any inconvenience caused. That was all. Any inconvenience caused. As though she had been waiting for a delivery. The boy bolted the moment she took the paper. She heard the side door close behind him with a soft, definitive click. Vivienne read the note twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and placed it inside her glove, against her wrist, where she could feel the paper against her pulse. She did not know why she did this. She did it anyway. Beyond the door, she heard her father's voice now, low, rapid, managing. The sound of benches, people rising. The organ fell silent entirely, and in the silence the church sounded enormous and very empty. The vestibule door opened. Her father stood in the frame. His face was a controlled disaster, years of military bearing holding something shapeless and ugly behind the eyes. "Vivienne." "Not yet," she said. He stopped. "Please," she said, "not yet." He looked at her. Then he stepped back and closed the door and left her alone. She sat for a long time. The guests left in stages, she could track it by sound. The larger murmur thinning, footsteps on stone, carriages on the cobbles outside. Then smaller sounds. Then almost nothing. The vicar came once and knocked softly, and she said not yet again, and he did not come back. She sat in her ivory silk dress in the cold vestibule and looked at the door that Edmund had not come through, and she tried to understand what had happened. She constructed explanations: an accident, an illness, something sudden and terrible that had made it impossible. She took each explanation and examined it and set it aside. She was not, she discovered, a woman who was capable of lying to herself for very long. It was an inconvenient quality. He had not come. Whatever the reason, he had not come. And she was sitting in a church in a dress that cost more than her father earned in 3 months, and the note in her glove said inconvenience, and the roses were still very bright against the stone walls. After a while she stood up. She smoothed her dress. She straightened her gloves. She opened the vestibule door and walked into the empty nave, her footsteps sharp and clear on the stone floor, echoing up into the vaulted ceiling where no one was listening. She walked the length of the nave alone. She walked through the main doors and out into the cold March air. The square was nearly empty now. One carriage remained, her father's. He was standing beside it, and when he saw her, he took a single step forward and then stopped, as though he couldn't decide what the correct gesture was. She stopped in front of him. She looked at him carefully. There was something in his face that she had no name for yet. Something that was not only grief on her behalf. Something that looked, in the thin gray light of the March afternoon, almost like guilt. She filed it away. She would think about it later. "Take me home, please," she said. He handed her into the carriage without a word. She rode home in her wedding dress and watched London pass outside the window, and she did not cry, and she did not understand yet how much of her life was going to be built in the ruins of this morning. But she could feel it already, somewhere below thought, the way one feels a change in the weather before it arrives. The note said inconvenience. She pressed her wrist against her knee and felt the paper there, and she thought, I will not be an inconvenience, not to anyone, not ever again. She meant it. That was the thing about Vivienne Ashby. When she decided something, she meant it. The talk lasted 6 weeks. Vivienne knew this because she counted. She had developed in the days following the 14th of March a precise and almost clinical relationship with information. What people were saying, where they were saying it, how loudly, and when they stopped. Information was the only thing she could control. So she tracked it the way a general tracks enemy movement, without sentiment, without flinching. The first week was the worst. The story had all the elements that London society required for maximum circulation: a titled man, a woman of insufficient standing, a church full of witnesses, and an absence so complete it bordered on theatrical. People who had not attended the wedding spoke about it as though they had been in the front pew. People who had been in the front pew spoke about it as though they had been standing beside her in the vestibule. Details multiplied and shifted. By the end of the first week, she had heard 3 different versions of what the note had said, none of them accurate. The second week the sympathy arrived, which was in some ways worse than the talk. Women she barely knew called at the house with careful expressions and carefully chosen words that managed to convey both compassion and a thorough cataloging of her situation. She received them in the parlor. She poured tea. She said the correct things in the correct tone. She did not cry. She did not say Edmund's name. Her father moved through the house during this period like a man navigating around something he couldn't look at directly. He was present at meals. He answered when spoken to. But there was a quality to his silence that Vivienne found increasingly difficult to ignore, a weight to it, a texture, something that was not simply the silence of a father in pain for his daughter. She watched him. She said nothing. Not yet. Edmund's absence from London was confirmed by the third week. He had left, no one knew precisely when or where. His townhouse was closed. His secretary, when approached by the more determined of his acquaintances, offered only that his Grace had gone to attend to matters on one of the northern estates. There was no forwarding address. There were no letters of explanation. There was nothing, only the closed house and the shuttered windows and the particular silence of a building from which the person has departed in a hurry. Vivienne heard this from Mrs. Alcott, who had it from Lady Fenwick, who had it from someone whose name changed with each telling. She received the information, processed it, and added it to her collection. He had left London. He had not written. She allowed herself exactly one evening with this information, sitting alone in her room after her father had gone to bed, the note from the church unfolded on the table in front of her, the candle burning down. She looked at the note. She thought about the garden in Surrey, the fireflies, his voice saying whatever makes you feel most like yourself. She thought about the letters in the box under her bed, the particular slant of his handwriting, the way he had of making her feel that her opinions were worth the space they took up in a room. Then she folded the note again. She placed it back in the box. She closed the box and pushed it under the bed, and she went asleep. She did not take it out again. By the 6th week the talk had thinned to a murmur, the way fires do when they run out of new material. London was already finding other things to discuss, a scandal in Parliament, a duchess who had said something inadvisable at a dinner, the usual commerce of other people's misfortunes. Vivienne felt the attention lift from her like a physical weight and found, to her own surprise, that its absence was not relief but something closer to exposure. The talk, at least, had been something solid. This new quiet had no shape. It was in this quiet that her father came to her one evening after dinner. He sat in the chair across from her. He was holding his glass of port but not drinking it, turning it slowly in his hands, the same gesture, she realized, that Edmund had made with his hat in the rain. 30 years and a different life away in the future she didn't know yet. "I have been thinking," her father said, "that a change of air might be beneficial." Vivienne set down her book. "For whom?" "For you," he looked at the port. "For both of us, perhaps. There is a cousin of your mother's in Shropshire. She has written several times to say she would welcome company. The village is small but pleasant. I thought perhaps—" "You want me to leave London," Vivienne said. "I want you to be somewhere that is not here," he said, and the honesty of it, so uncharacteristic, so plainly exhausted, stopped her from saying the thing she had been about to say. She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. Something moved through his face, not quite relief, not quite. "All right," she said again, and picked up her book. Shropshire in April was a different country entirely. The village of Renfield sat in a shallow valley between two hills that went green so suddenly, and so completely in the spring that it seemed almost indecent, as though the landscape were trying too hard, making promises it couldn't possibly keep through an English winter. The cousin, a widow named Mrs. Haverstock, was small and sharp-eyed and direct in a way that Vivienne found immediately restoring. She asked no questions about London. She showed Vivienne her bedroom, her garden, and the path to the village, and then left her entirely alone, which was the greatest kindness anyone had shown her in 6 weeks. Vivienne walked. She walked every morning, long routes through the hills and along the river, in weather that was frequently indifferent to her comfort and occasionally hostile. She walked until her legs ached and her mind went quiet, and the particular noise of the past weeks faded to something she could almost not hear. She began slowly to think about what came next. She had no income of her own. She had accomplishments in French, reasonable Italian, a genuine facility with mathematics that had always been slightly inconvenient in social settings, and a capacity for reading that had given her, over 22 years, a fairly comprehensive informal education. She thought about these things practically, as assets, without sentiment. By June, she had written to the village school. By September, she was teaching. The school was a single room attached to the church, with 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, a fireplace that smoked badly in the east wind, and a collection of books in such poor condition that Vivienne spent the first month of her salary having them rebound. She was good at it. This surprised her slightly, and then it didn't. She had always been good at making people feel that what they were saying was worth listening to. It was, she supposed, simply a matter of direction. She applied it to a 14-year-old boy who believed himself incapable of mathematics and discovered by December that he was not incapable at all, merely convinced. She applied it to a 6-year-old girl who was afraid of reading aloud, and discovered that the child read beautifully when no one was watching her face while she did it. She stopped thinking about Edmund in February of 1844, or at least she stopped thinking about him deliberately. He appeared sometimes in the unguarded edges of sleep, and occasionally when she was walking and her mind went quiet enough to let old things surface. She let him surface and then she let him go, the way one releases a caught breath, not without effort, not without the faint residual ache, but cleanly, completely. She did not hate him. She had considered it. It would have been simpler in many ways, and she understood why people chose it. But she found, when she examined the question honestly, that she didn't have access to hatred. What she had instead was something harder and quieter, a knowledge of what had happened that she carried without drama, that shaped the way she moved through the world without defining it. She was 23. She had work she was good at and a room that was hers and hills she could walk in any weather. It was not the life she had imagined. It was, she was discovering, a life nonetheless. It was Mrs. Pierce who said it. Mrs. Pierce was 71, the oldest resident of Renfield, a woman who had lived in the same cottage for 50 years, and as a consequence knew everything about everyone within a 5-mile radius. She was not a gossip. Gossips enjoy what they know, and Mrs. Pierce seemed to regard her knowledge as simply one more responsibility she had accumulated over a long life and managed without complaint. She and Vivienne had formed an unlikely friendship over the preceding months, conducted primarily on Mrs. Pierce's doorstep, where the old woman sat most afternoons regardless of weather. Vivienne passed on her evening walks. She stopped. They talked. It was an arrangement that suited them both. It was an October evening in 1844, 7 months after Vivienne had arrived in Renfield, when Mrs. Pierce said it. Without preamble, without drama, in the same tone she used to discuss the weather. "The Duke came looking for you, you know, some months back." Vivienne stopped walking. Mrs. Pierce was looking out across the lane, placid, unhurried, as though she had simply mentioned something of mild local interest. "I beg your pardon," Vivienne said. Tall man, dark coat, came into the village asking if anyone knew a Miss Ashby. Mrs. Pierce considered. April, I think it was, or early May. The hawthorn was still up. April, 6 weeks after the wedding. Vivienne stood very still. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I might know where you were walking of a morning." Mrs. Pierce turned her gaze from the lane to Vivienne with the calm interest of someone watching a very slow and entirely predictable sequence of events. He sat on that wall there for the better part of an hour. Then he got back on his horse and rode out. Vivienne looked at the wall, a perfectly ordinary stone wall. She had passed it every day for 7 months. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. She heard to her own surprise that her voice was quite steady. Mrs. Pierce looked at her with something that was not unkind. "You didn't seem like a woman who wanted finding," she said. "Not then." Vivienne opened her mouth, closed it. She looked at the wall for another moment. Then she said good night to Mrs. Pierce and continued her walk, going further than she usually did, past the edge of the village and up the hill where the wind came in from the west with nothing to slow it, and she stood there in the October dark and let it hit her full in the face. He had come. He had sat on the wall and waited and then gone away. She stood there for a long time, the wind pulling at her coat, and she tried to make the two things fit together in the same mind, the note in the church, and the man on the wall, the inconvenience and the hour of waiting. She could not make them fit. She walked back down the hill in the dark, let herself into Mrs. Haverstock's house, went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed. She did not take the box out from under the bed. She did not take it out, but she knew it was there. She lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling, and she thought, "Why did you come? And why, if you came, did you go away again?" The ceiling had no answer. By morning she had put it away, filed it in the place she kept things she could not resolve, the place she had gotten quite good at maintaining over the past year. Organized, inaccessible, functional. She rose, she washed, she went to school. She taught the 14-year-old his mathematics. She listened to the 6-year-old read without watching her face. She did not think about a man sitting on a wall in April, waiting. She was very nearly successful. The morning of the 14th of March had begun, for Edmund at 5 o'clock. He had not slept. This was not unusual for him before significant events. His mind had always been the kind that refused to quiet itself at convenient moments, that preferred to work through problems in the small hours when there was nothing else demanding its attention. He had lain in the dark of his bedroom in the Ashford townhouse and thought about Vivienne with a thoroughness that was almost methodical. Her face in the garden in Surrey, the way she argued, the particular quality of her attention when she was genuinely interested in something, which was different from the performed interest he had grown up surrounded by and had learned, young, to distinguish from the real thing. He had been in the dark of that bedroom, entirely certain. He rose at 5. He dressed. He was ready by 7, which left 4 hours until the ceremony, which was 4 hours more than he needed and considerably fewer than his nerves required. He breakfasted without eating. He read 3 pages of the same article twice and retained nothing. He stood at his study window and watched London wake up in the thin March light and thought that the day was going to be the best of his life, and tried to behave like a man who was not slightly terrified of that fact. At 8:30, his mother's maid appeared at the study door. "Her Grace would like a word, my lord, if you have a moment." His mother's rooms were at the far end of the house, a suite she had occupied since his father's death 12 years ago, and furnished in a style that managed to be simultaneously austere and overwhelming. Dark wood, heavy drapes, portraits of ancestors who all appeared to have found existence faintly disappointing. The Duchess Helena was sitting at her writing table when Edmund entered, upright as always, dressed as though she were receiving visitors, her hands folded in front of her with the particular stillness of a woman who had spent 60 years mastering the art of controlled presentation. She did not look like a woman who had slept poorly. She looked like a woman who had been waiting. "Sit down, Edmund." He remained standing. It was a small thing, a habit from boyhood. She had always asked him to sit when she wanted the advantage, and he had learned, somewhere in adolescence, to deny her it. "I have a great deal to do this morning, mother, if this can wait." "It cannot." She reached to the side of her writing table and picked up a document. She held it out to him. He crossed the room and took it. It was 2 pages, closely written. A formal agreement, the kind drawn up by solicitors, the kind that existed to be signed and witnessed and kept in a safe place. His eyes moved down the page with the speed of a man who had learned to read contracts carefully, and then slowed, and then stopped. He read it again. The party of the first part, General Arthur Ashby. The party of the second part, the estate of Ashford, represented by the Duchess Helena Cavendish. The terms: a sum of money, a substantial sum, more than a general's annual salary, more than was comfortable to read about in this context, paid in exchange for the withdrawal of Miss Vivienne Ashby from her engagement to the 5th Duke of Ashford, with the full knowledge and consent of Miss Vivienne Ashby, who had communicated through her father her wish to dissolve the arrangement. At the bottom, her father's signature, and beside it, in a space left for the purpose, the words consented to and agreed in Arthur Ashby's hand, and the date. 3 weeks ago. Edmund read it a 3rd time. Then he set it down on his mother's writing table with a care that was not calm. It was the opposite of calm. It was the effort of a man keeping his hands from shaking by concentrating on a single deliberate movement. "What is this?" he said. It was not a question. "It is what it appears to be." His mother's voice was even measured, the voice she used when she had decided something and considered the matter settled. "The girl's father approached me in February. He was concerned, as I was, that his daughter was making a decision she would come to regret. The disparity in your positions, Edmund, the social consequences for her, the inevitable difficulties." She paused. He was persuaded that a clean separation, with appropriate provision for the family, would be in everyone's interest, including hers. Edmund looked at her. "She agreed to this," he said. "Her father speaks for her in these matters, as is proper." "She agreed to this," he said again, because he needed to hear what the sentence sounded like a second time, needed to test it against what he knew, what he thought he knew, the 40 minutes near the bookcase and the garden in Surrey and the letters he had written and the letters she had sent back, careful, honest, entirely herself. "Women often find it easier," his mother said, "to allow their fathers to communicate these things. It avoids unpleasantness." The clock on her mantelpiece read 20 minutes to 9. Edmund picked up the document. He looked at the signature. Arthur Ashby's hand, he had seen it on one letter, one formal letter of permission sent at the beginning of the courtship. It matched. He looked at the words beside it, consented to and agreed. He looked at the date. 3 weeks ago. While he had been writing to her, while she had been writing back, while he had been standing at his study window in the early mornings thinking about the 14th of March. He set the document down. "I am going to be late," he said, and walked out of the room. He told himself in the carriage that he did not believe it. He told himself that his mother was capable of this. He had always known she was capable of this, had known it the way one knows about structural cracks in a beloved building, visible if you look directly at them, easier not to look. He told himself that the signature could be explained, that there was another version of events, that he would go to Vivienne and she would look at him with that direct, clear look of hers and tell him what had actually happened. He told himself all of this in the carriage, and then the carriage stopped. Not at the church, outside the church. Because between his mother's rooms and the front door, between the document on the writing table and the carriage waiting in the street, 40 minutes had passed. 40 minutes he could not entirely account for, his mother talking, a footman appearing with something urgent, a delay that had seemed ordinary in the moment, and in retrospect, had the precise dimensions of something engineered. He looked at his watch. 5 minutes past 11. He was out of the carriage before it fully stopped. The church was not empty, but it was emptying. He came through the main doors into the nave, and saw the last of the guests filing out through the side exits, the particular movement of a crowd that is dispersing from an event that has gone wrong, quick and quiet, and not meeting each other's eyes. The vicar was speaking to a woman near the altar. Two men he recognized from his club turned and saw him, and turned away again with an immediacy that told him everything about what the past hour had looked like from the outside. He went to the vestibule. Empty. He stood in the cold, small room and looked at the chair where she had apparently been sitting, and the closed door, and the white roses going slightly warm in the enclosed air, and he understood, in a way that went below thought, that he was too late. Not by 5 minutes. Not in the way that could be explained and apologized for and recovered from. Too late in a way that had a different character entirely. He left the church. The carriage to her father's house took 11 minutes. He counted them. The door was answered, after a long pause, by Arthur Ashby himself. This was unusual. There were servants. There should have been a servant. And the unusualness of it registered somewhere at the back of Edmund's mind, while the front of his mind was occupied entirely with the man's face. Arthur Ashby looked like a man who had been expecting this knock. He stood in the doorway and did not invite Edmund in, and his expression had the quality of something prepared in advance, grief for his daughter's sake, and beneath it, so faint that Edmund might have imagined it, something else. A steadiness that was not quite natural, a man standing on ground he had already chosen. "I need to see her," Edmund said. "She isn't here." "Where?" "She doesn't want to see you." Arthur Ashby's voice was flat. Not cruel, that would have been easier in some ways. Simply flat, final. A man closing a door in a way that had nothing to do with the door. "She has asked me to tell you that she does not wish to receive any communication from you, that she wishes the matter to be considered concluded." Edmund looked at him. "I want to hear that from her." "I am telling you on her behalf." "With respect, General, that is not sufficient. After this morning, after what?" "She was distressed this morning. A flicker of something, quickly controlled. She has had time to reflect. Her wishes are as I have stated." Edmund stood on the doorstep for a moment. He could feel the document in his coat. He had taken it from his mother's table when he left, folded it, put it in his pocket without entirely deciding to. He could push past this man. He could demand to search the house. He could do a number of things. He looked at Arthur Ashby's face. And something in him, some part that had grown up watching his mother engineer outcomes and had learned, at cost, what it looked like when the ground had already been prepared, when the positions had already been chosen, when the conversation you were having was not the conversation that actually mattered, something in him said, "She signed it. Her father has her consent. You have the document." He stepped back. "Please tell her," he said, and his voice came out level, which surprised him, "that I came." Arthur Ashby said nothing. Edmund walked back to his carriage. He sat in it for a long time before he told the driver to go. He left London 4 days later. He went north, to the smallest of the Ashford estates, a property in Northumberland that no one wanted and everyone forgot about, where the wind came off the moors with nothing between it and you, and the house was cold even in summer. He went because he needed somewhere that had no associations, no memories, no surfaces that reflected anything back at him. He stayed for 3 months. He did not write to Vivienne. She had made her wishes clear, or her father had, which was the same thing, which had to be the same thing, because the alternative was something he could not afford to examine directly. Not yet. Not while he was still capable of functioning. He thought about the document. He thought about her signature, her father's consent, consented to and agreed. He thought about her letters, the last one, received 10 days before the wedding, talking about a book she had found that he needed to read, talking about the view from her bedroom window in the March light, talking about 14 days. He thought about these things until they stopped being things he could think about and became simply part of the permanent landscape of his interior life. Present, unresolvable, no longer actively burning but not gone either. He did not go back to London for 6 months. When he did, she was already gone. He heard it from someone, a passing mention, a sentence at a dinner party, that General Ashby's daughter had gone to stay with relations in the country indefinitely. He received this information and filed it in the same unresolvable place. He did not ask where. He told himself he was respecting her wishes. He told himself this for 9 years. His mother never mentioned Vivienne again. This was, he would understand later, the most deliberate thing about her. A lesser strategist might have pressed the advantage, might have immediately produced an acceptable replacement, might have referenced the matter as proof of her judgment, might have said "I told you" in any of the 100 ways that phrase can be communicated without words. Helena Cavendish did none of this. She simply absorbed his return to London into the existing fabric of their relationship, maintained her usual impeccable courtesy, and never once, in 9 years, said the name Vivienne Ashby in his presence. He had thought for a long time that this was her nature, the ability to close a chapter completely and move forward without looking back. He understood only later that it was something else entirely. It was the composure of a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted and saw no reason to discuss it further. She died on a Wednesday in September. The illness had been quick, 6 weeks from the first sign to the end, which was a mercy of sorts, or at least an efficiency. Edmund sat with her in the final days because she was his mother and he was her son, and there were some obligations that existed below the level of feeling, that did not require warmth to be honored. She was lucid until nearly the end. On the Tuesday night, she asked him to send the nurse out. He sat beside her bed in the dark room with its heavy drapes and its portrait ancestors, and he waited. She turned her head on the pillow and looked at him with her eyes very clear and her face, without its usual careful management, simply old and tired and small in a way that startled him. "There is something," she said, "that I should tell you." Her voice was thin. He had to lean forward to hear it. "The document," she said. Edmund went very still. "The girl's father came to me." Each sentence was effortful now, measured out. "I approached him first. I should say that I approached him. He was amenable." A pause. The signature on the consent line, that was not "I had it written by someone whose hand could be made to serve." She closed her eyes. "The girl knew nothing of it. I want you to know that. She knew nothing of any of it." The room was very quiet. "She never agreed," Edmund said. It was not a question. It was a thing being spoken aloud for the first time, a thing that had been waiting for 9 years in the unresolvable place. "No," his mother said. Edmund stood up. He walked to the window. Outside, the London night was doing what it always did, indifferent, continuous, unbothered by the dimensions of what had just been said in this room. He stood at the window for a long time. Behind him, his mother's breathing was shallow and even. "Edmund," she said after a while. He did not turn around. "I did what I thought was necessary," she said. "For the family, for you, you would have been." "Don't," he said, quietly, without heat. There was no heat available. Whatever he had thought anger would feel like in the moment when he finally understood everything, it was not this. This was something much colder and much larger. "Please don't." She didn't. She died the following afternoon, with the nurse present and the curtains drawn and Edmund sitting in a chair by the window, looking at the street below, watching strangers pass with no knowledge of what was happening in this room. He sat there for a long time after. Then he stood up. He went to her writing table, the same chair, the same dark wood, and he found in the top drawer the original document. He recognized it immediately. He had seen it once for 5 minutes 9 years ago, and he had never forgotten a word of it. He also found in the same drawer a letter, in his mother's handwriting, dated 2 days before her death. He read it standing at the table, in the failing September light. She had written everything: the approach to Arthur Ashby, the sum paid, the fabricated consent, the forged line. She had written it with the precision of a woman clearing an account, not apologizing exactly but recording, stating facts. Perhaps because she had understood in the end that facts were the only currency that would have any value to him. At the bottom she had written, "I believed I was protecting you. I am aware that this is not the same as being right." Edmund folded the letter and put it in his coat. He stood in his mother's room for another moment. Then he went downstairs, called for his horse, and rode out into the September evening with one thought that had the weight and clarity of something that had been forming for 9 years and was now, finally, complete. He had to find her. Finding her took 3 weeks. He had expected it to take longer. He had prepared himself in some obscure way for a search that would extend into months. A penance of sorts, a proportional difficulty, the universe requiring him to work for what his mother had taken. Instead, it took 3 weeks, which felt both insufficient and like a very long time, depending on which part of him was doing the measuring. He started with her father. Arthur Ashby was living in reduced circumstances in a modest house in Kensington. The military pension, no more. The comfortable home of Edmund's memory now replaced by something smaller and quieter and slightly dusty in the way of houses where one person lives alone and has stopped noticing certain things. The man who opened the door was older than Edmund had expected, diminished in some way that went beyond the physical, as though the years had taken something structural out of him. He saw Edmund and his face did something complicated. "Your Grace," he said. "I know what you did," Edmund said. "I know what my mother did and I know what you did. I'm not here to discuss it." Arthur Ashby held the door with one hand. He looked at Edmund for a moment with the eyes of a man who has been waiting for a particular reckoning and is not entirely sorry it has arrived. "Where is she?" Edmund said. A long pause. "Shropshire," Arthur Ashby said. "A village called Renfield." He paused again. "She teaches school there. She has been there since for some years." Edmund nodded once. He turned and walked back to his horse. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. He rode to Renfield in 2 days, stopping once, arriving in the late afternoon of an October day when the valley was doing something extraordinary with the light, going gold in a way that seemed almost deliberate, the hills catching it and holding it just long enough that a person arriving from the gray north might feel, obscurely, that they had arrived somewhere that was trying to make a point. He did not find it comforting. He found the village, the single lane of it, the church at one end and the public house at the other and the scattering of cottages in between. He found the school, a small stone room attached to the church, dark now, the day finished. He found the public house and took a room because he needed somewhere to put himself while he worked out what came next. What came next, he had thought, would be obvious once he arrived. He would find her. He would explain. He would show her the letter, his mother's letter, the confession, the facts laid out in his mother's own careful hand. She would understand. Perhaps she would not forgive him immediately. He had no expectation of immediately. He had no right to immediately, but she would understand, and understanding was somewhere to begin. This had seemed, in London, like a reasonable sequence of events. In Renfield, sitting in a small room above the public house with his mother's letter in his coat and the valley going dark outside his window, it seemed considerably less reasonable. It seemed, in fact, like the plan of a man who had spent 3 weeks focused on the logistics of finding someone and had not spent nearly enough time thinking about what finding her actually meant. She had built a life here. He had heard it in her father's voice, not pride. Arthur Ashby had forfeited the right to pride, but something factual, something that communicated a reality he was not going to be able to simply step into and rearrange. She teaches school there. Years of it. A room of her own, a routine, a village that knew her name, students who depended on her, mornings she had shaped entirely without reference to him. He sat with this for a long time. Then he went to find her. He saw her before she saw him. She was coming down the lane from the direction of the hills, alone, in a dark coat, walking with the particular purposeful ease of someone who has covered this ground many times and is not thinking about her feet. The evening light was behind her. She was 32 years old and he had last seen her. The last time he had actually seen her, in a room, breathing, at a house party in Surrey when she was 21, talking about a paper on Pompeii with grass stains on the hem of her dress from a walk that had gone longer than intended. She looked like herself. This was the thing that struck him first and stayed with him longest, not that she had changed, though she had, but that the change was all addition. Whatever the years had taken from her, and he understood they had taken things, they had also given her something in exchange. A quality of settledness. A person who has become entirely who they are. He was standing near the wall outside the public house. She saw him when she was perhaps 20 feet away. She stopped. He watched her face do something very controlled and very quick, a sequence of expressions that she managed, in the space of perhaps 2 seconds, to contain almost entirely. Almost. He had always been good at reading her face, and she had always been better than almost anyone he knew at controlling it, and in the gap between those two facts he saw recognition, shock, something that might have been, for 1/2 second, almost gladness, and then the closing down of all of it behind an expression of perfect, careful neutrality. She stood there and looked at him. He had rehearsed this moment for 3 weeks. He had versions of it, what he would say first, how he would approach it, the precise sequence in which information should be offered. All of it left him entirely. He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands and 9 years of things he had no adequate words for, and said the only true thing available. "I know I have no right to be here." She looked at him for a long moment. The lane was quiet. From somewhere behind him came the distant sound of the public house, a murmur of voices, someone laughing. "No," she said, "you don't." And she walked past him, into the cottage directly across the lane, and closed the door. He went back to the public house. He ordered dinner and did not eat it. He ordered something to drink and managed some of it. He sat at the table in the corner and watched the fire and tried to decide what to do next, which was difficult because part of him felt that he had already used up any right he had to decide things where Vivienne Ashby was concerned. She had not slammed the door. He found himself returning to this. She had closed it firmly, definitively, but without drama. A woman who was angry slammed doors. A woman who was done with you closed them quietly. He could not decide which category he was in and suspected that, in some ways, it didn't matter. The door was closed either way. He went to bed. He did not sleep. In the morning, he was standing on the lane at 7 o'clock, in the cold, because he did not know what else to do. She came out of the cottage at 7:30, coat and hat, bag over her arm, going to the school, obviously, because it was a school day and she was a teacher and her life had a structure that did not pause for him. She saw him immediately. She was not surprised, which told him she had considered the possibility. She stopped. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He reached into his coat and took out the letter. He held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it. "What is that?" "My mother's letter, written 2 days before she died. It explains." He stopped. The word asterisk explains was wrong. It did not explain anything. It documented. It tells you what happened the morning of the 14th, what she did, what your father was paid to do. He kept his voice even. You should know what actually happened. Whatever you decide after that is entirely yours, but you should know. She looked at the letter in his outstretched hand. She looked at his face. Then she walked past him to the school without taking it. He stood in the lane with the letter in his hand, and the October morning getting colder around him, and he thought, all right. All right. He put the letter back in his coat. He was not going to force it. He was not going to stand in her lane every morning making her walk past him. He had come, he had offered, she had refused, and he had no more claim on her attention than she chose to give him. He went inside. He told the publican he would be staying another night. That was all, one more night. He told himself this was a decision and not a postponement. He stayed 4 days. He did not approach her again. He walked in the mornings, up the hill roads that she probably also walked, not looking for her, not engineering an encounter, simply needing to move because stillness had become intolerable. The valley was extraordinary in the October light. He could see why someone might stay here, why someone might build something worth having in this particular piece of the world. He ate at the public house. He spoke to the publican, who was a man of approximately 70 with the characteristically Shropshire quality of being perfectly friendly and entirely unimpressed by anything. He spoke to no one else. He asked no questions about her. On the 3rd day he was sitting outside the public house in the afternoon. There was an unexpected hour of pale sun, and he had taken it, when Mrs. Pierce came and sat beside him. He had not spoken to her before. He had seen her, on her doorstep, watching the lane with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and no particular obligations regarding what she does with it. She was very old and very small, and she sat down beside him on the bench without being invited, which he found, in his current state, oddly restoring. "You're the Duke," she said, not a question. "Yes." "She told you to go away." "She didn't tell me anything. She closed a door." Mrs. Pierce considered this. "Same thing, usually." "Yes," he said, "usually." They sat in the thin October sun for a moment. Below them the lane was quiet, a cat crossing from one side to the other with great deliberateness. "She's not a woman who does things lightly," Mrs. Pierce said eventually. "What she builds carefully, takes her a long time." A pause. "Takes her a long time to unbuild things too." Edmund looked at the cat, which had reached the other side and was now sitting in a patch of sun, with the self-satisfaction of a creature that has completed its objectives for the day. "I'm not asking her to unbuild anything," he said. "No," Mrs. Pierce sounded interested, in the mild way of someone for whom interest is a permanent condition. "What are you asking her?" He thought about it. "To know the truth," he said. "That's all. She deserves to know what actually happened, what she does with it." He stopped. Said Mrs. Pierce, which communicated nothing specific and somehow everything general. She rose eventually and went back to her doorstep. Edmund sat in the October sun until it went behind the hill, and the cold came back. On the 4th day he settled his bill with the publican, saddled his horse, and prepared to leave. He wrote a note. Not long. He had written her long letters before, at 28, and known exactly what to say, and been entirely wrong about what was happening. He was not going to make that mistake again. He wrote 4 sentences. He folded the note and left it with the publican with instructions to deliver it across the lane, and then he rode out of Renfield without looking back. The note said, "The letter is with Mr. Graves at the public house. It is yours whenever you want it, or never, as you prefer. I came because you deserve the truth, not because I have any claim on what you do with it. I am sorry not for coming, but for everything that made it necessary." He rode back to London in the grey October afternoon, and told himself that was the end of it. He managed to believe this for approximately 6 days. On the 7th day he found himself sitting at his desk in the Ashford townhouse, the same desk where he had sat on the morning of the 14th of March 10 years ago, looking at the same window with the same London light coming through it, and he understood, with the resigned clarity of a man who has been arguing with himself and lost, that it was not the end of it. It was not going to be the end of it. Whatever she decided, whatever she did with the letter and the truth and the 9 years, it was not going to be the end of it for him. He was not going to write to her. He was not going to go back to Renfield. He was going to wait, because waiting was the only thing he had any right to do, and he was going to do it without expectation, because expectation was a thing he had lost the right to somewhere on a doorstep in Kensington, or a church in Hanover Square, or a morning 9 years ago, when he had been too willing to believe what was in front of him, because believing it was easier than fighting for what he knew. He sat at his desk. He waited. He was, it turned out, considerably better at it than he had expected. He had, after all, been practicing for 9 years. The letter sat with Mr. Graves for 11 days. Vivienne knew this because she counted, which she found irritating, because counting implied a level of attention she had decided not to give the matter. She had decided this on the morning after Edmund's first appearance in the lane, standing at her kitchen window with her tea going cold in her hand, conducting what she considered to be a perfectly reasonable internal negotiation with herself. The negotiation went as follows. He had come. That was a fact. She could not unknow it, could not unsee the figure standing in the lane with his hat in his hands and the rain on his coat, could not unhear those 8 words, "I know I have no right to be here," which she had replayed, despite herself, approximately 40 times in the subsequent 12 hours. These were facts. She filed them. What she was not going to do was allow facts to destabilize the life she had built, which was a good life, a life she had constructed with considerable effort out of the rubble of a morning in March, and which did not require the Duke of Ashford or his hat or his 8 words or whatever was in that letter to continue being a good life. This was the negotiation. She considered it settled. She went to school. The school helped. It always did. There was something about the specific requirements of a room full of children, their absolute presentness, their inability to be politely vague, their tendency to ask the exact question you were least prepared for, that made it impossible to be simultaneously elsewhere in your mind. She taught. She listened. She corrected, encouraged, explained. Thomas Whitfield, 14, was working through algebraic problems now with a confidence that still gave her a small private satisfaction every time she watched him do it. Clara Baines, 7, had recently discovered that she liked reading aloud to the younger children, and was doing so with an authority entirely disproportionate to her size. These were real things, solid things, things she had made. She focused on them. She was successful at this mostly, except for certain moments. The end of the school day when the children left and the room went quiet, the walk home in the evenings when the lane required her to pass the public house, the particular hour between 10 and 11 at night when she had run out of tasks and the cottage was still around her. In those moments, she thought about the letter. She didn't want to think about it. She thought about it anyway, the way one thinks about a tooth that may or may not need attention, not wanting to investigate too closely, aware that investigation might confirm something that would require a response. She knew, in the part of herself, that she was being careful not to consult directly what the letter probably said. She was not a stupid woman. She had spent 10 years filing away the things that didn't fit, the Mrs. Pierce information, the note that said inconvenience, her father's face on the morning of the 14th and again on the doorstep in Kensington, the quality of his silence on the carriage ride home. She had filed them because she had no framework that made them cohere, no explanation that turned them from separate, uncomfortable facts into a single legible truth. The letter was probably that explanation. She went to school, she walked home, she passed the public house, she did not stop. On the 11th day she stopped. Mr. Graves was a man who had been running the public house in Renfield for 30 years, and had developed, over that time, a comprehensive understanding of which of his customers' affairs were his business and which were not. He handed her the letter without comment, without expression, without any indication that he had an opinion about her standing in his doorway at 4:30 in the afternoon asking for something a man had left for her 11 days ago. She thanked him. She went home. She put the letter on the kitchen table and looked at it while she made her tea. Then she carried her tea to the table, sat down and picked it up. The handwriting on the outside was Edmund's. She had not seen it in 10 years, and it was immediately, completely familiar, which she found enraging in a way she decided to set aside for later. She opened it. It was not a long letter. Edmund had not written her a long letter, which she had half expected and half dreaded, the long letter being the kind of thing guilty men produced, many pages of explanation and self-justification that required a corresponding amount of energy to read and resist. This was something else. 8 pages in his mother's hand, precise and thorough, and then 1 page, only one in Edmund's at the end. She read the Duchess's account first. She read it with the same careful, methodical attention she brought to everything, not rushing, not skipping ahead, not allowing herself to react until she had the full shape of it. The approach to her father, the sum, the fabricated consent, the forged signature. She read it twice, the second time more slowly, and then she set those pages down and sat with what she had read. It had the quality of a thing she had already known. Not known consciously, she had not sat in this kitchen at any point in the past 10 years and thought, "My father was paid, the signature was forged, I was never consulted." She had not thought this. But the shape of it, the contour of it, fit something that had been waiting for a shape. All the filed things, her father's face, the quality of his silences, the money that had appeared quietly in the household, accounts the summer of 1843 that she had noticed and not asked about because she had been 22 and preoccupied with something else. They fit. They cohered. They became, in the space of 8 pages, a single legible truth. She picked up Edmund's page. He had written 4 things: that he had come to Renfield because she deserved the truth, that he had no claim on what she did with it, that he was sorry, not for coming, but for everything that made it necessary. And one other thing at the very end, which she read and then put down and did not pick up again. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Outside the window, the October afternoon was doing its usual things, the light going amber, the hill going dark, a bird moving through the hedges with small, decisive sounds. The cottage was very quiet. She had always liked the quiet here. She had chosen it, initially, as an absence of noise, as relief after London, and it had become over the years something else, not absence but presence, the particular inhabited silence of a place that is genuinely yours. She thought about her father's face on the morning of the 14th, the way he had looked at the floor when he came to tell her there might be a delay, the way he had stood outside the church when she walked out, 1 step forward and then stopped, as though the correct gesture was beyond him. The way he had looked, not only like a father in pain, but like a man who knew precisely why he was in it. She thought about Edmund at 28, standing in a garden in Surrey in the dark, his voice saying whatever makes you feel most like yourself. She thought about the note, any inconvenience caused, and the handwriting that was not his. She thought about Mrs. Pierce, and the wall, and April, and the hawthorn still up. She thought about 11 years, 10 years of building, 1 year of his mother dying and his coming here and leaving a letter with Mr. Graves, and all of it underneath always, like something that had never quite finished settling. She stood up. She crossed the kitchen to the window and looked out at the lane. The public house across the way, its windows going warm in the early dark. A cat on the wall, the same cat, or a different one, it was impossible to say. The lane itself empty, the way it always was at this hour. He was not there. He had left. He had offered her the truth, and when she hadn't taken it, he had left anyway, which was, she tried to find the word for it, the accurate word, the word that didn't do more work than was warranted, which was correct, which was the right thing, which told her something about how he understood the situation that the long, defensive letter would not have told her. She turned away from the window. She picked up the letter from the table. She read Edmund's page again, standing in her kitchen in the early dark, and this time she let herself read the last thing he had written, the thing she had put down and not picked up the first time. He had written, "I looked for you. The morning of the church and after, your father said you never wanted to hear my name again. I believed him. I have thought, every day since I understood what that means, about what it cost you that I did." She stood there. The cottage was very quiet. She put the letter down on the table. She went to the door. She opened it. She looked at the lane, at the empty wall, at the public house across the way with its warm windows and its complete indifference to the dimensions of what was happening on her doorstep. She closed the door. She went back inside. She sat down at the table, and she put her face in her hands and she cried. She was not a woman who cried easily or often. She had cried twice in the year after the church, once the night before she left London, alone in her room at 2 in the morning, and once in February of 1844 when she had finally, definitively decided to stop waiting for something she could not name. Both times briefly, both times in private, both times with the sense of completing a necessary process rather than losing control of one. This was different. This went on for a long time. It surprised her, the extent of it, the sheer accumulated volume of it. 10 years of something she had filed and managed and contained, coming out now in her kitchen in the October dark because she had finally, at 32, read the document that explained everything she had spent a decade not understanding. She cried for the girl in the vestibule, who had waited 3 hours and gone home in her wedding dress. She cried for the woman who had spent a year filing things she couldn't make cohere. She cried for the man on the wall in April, who had waited an hour and then ridden away because her father had said she never wanted to hear his name again. She cried, eventually, for the 11 years themselves, the sheer waste of them, the particular cruelty of 2 people spending a decade in separate silences, each of them believing the other had chosen it. Then she stopped. She washed her face at the basin. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror, eyes red, expression unfamiliar. Something in her face that had been tightly held for a long time no longer held in the same way. She went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought with the careful, methodical attention she brought to everything, and what she thought about was this. She was 32 years old. She had built a life that was genuinely hers, that she was genuinely proud of, that did not require anyone else's presence to be valid or good or worth living. She had done this out of the rubble of a morning in March, and she had done it alone, and it had cost her things she would never entirely recover, and she was not ashamed of any of it. She was also 32 years old, and she had just read a letter that changed the shape of everything. Both of these things were true simultaneously. She lay in the dark and let them both be true. In the morning she rose at her usual time, she washed, she dressed, she made her tea. She took Edmund's page from the letter on the table and folded it separately from the Duchess's account and put it in her coat pocket. She went to school. She taught Thomas his mathematics. She listened to Clara read. She corrected, encouraged, explained. The fireplace smoked in the east wind, which it always did, and she opened the window on the opposite side the way she always did, and the room balanced itself out into something habitable, which it always did. At the end of the day, when the children had gone and the room was quiet, she sat at her desk and took out Edmund's page and read the last line again. "I have thought every day since I understood what that means, about what it cost you that I did." She sat with this for a long time. Then she put the page back in her pocket and went to find Mrs. Pierce. Mrs. Pierce was on her doorstep. She was always on her doorstep in all weathers, as though she had made a private agreement with the lane about keeping watch over it. Vivienne sat beside her on the low wall. They sat in silence for a moment, which was their habitual mode, the silence of a friendship that had never required a great deal of narration to function. "He came looking for me," Vivienne said. "Before, years ago, you told me." "April," Mrs. Pierce said, "or early May." "He sat on that wall." "About an hour." Vivienne looked at the wall across the lane. The cat was there again, or the other one, impossible to know. It was washing its face with the complete self-possession of a creature with no unresolved questions about its life. "Did he seem," she stopped, reconsidered the question, "what did he seem like?" Mrs. Pierce looked at the lane with the expression of someone consulting a memory they have kept carefully. "Like a man who wasn't sure he was doing the right thing," she said, "and then decided he wasn't, and left." Vivienne nodded slowly. "He came back last week," Mrs. Pierce said. "It was not a question." "Yes." "And now he's gone." "Yes." Mrs. Pierce was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the tone of someone stating something that has been obvious to them for quite some time, "You know where he is." Vivienne looked at her. "Mr. Graves," Mrs. Pierce said mildly, "is not a discreet man about everything." Vivienne almost smiled. It was not quite a smile. Her face was not, this evening, fully available for smiling, but the muscles moved in that direction, which was something. She sat on the wall for another few minutes. The lane went dark around them. The public house across the way began to make its evening sounds. Then she stood up. "Good night, Mrs. Pierce," she said. "Good night, dear," said Mrs. Pierce, in the tone of a woman who has known exactly how this was going to go for quite some time and is satisfied to have been right about it. Vivienne walked down the lane toward the public house. She did not think about what she was going to say. She had spent enough of her life preparing what she was going to say. She walked. The October dark came down around her, complete and cold and entirely indifferent. The public house door was warm light and the smell of wood smoke. She pushed it open and went in. He was at the corner table. He had not left. She stopped inside the door and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He started to rise, the reflex of a man who had been raised in certain habits, and she shook her head slightly, and he stopped. She crossed the room. She sat down across from him. She placed his letter on the table between them, Edmund's page face up, the last line visible. He looked at it, he looked at her. She said, "I don't forgive you." He nodded, "I know." "I don't forgive you," she said again, "because I haven't decided yet what there is to forgive you for specifically. You believed what you were given. You were deceived in the same direction I was, only differently." She stopped, started again. "I need to understand what happened, all of it, not the letter. The letter is your mother's account of your mother's actions. I want to know what you knew and when and what you thought and why you." Her voice did something she did not want it to do, and she stopped again and looked at the table. "Why I believed your father," Edmund said quietly. "Yes." A pause. "Because I had the document," he said, "and because your father was there in the door, and he seemed like a man telling the truth, and because—" He stopped. When he continued, his voice was careful, the voice of a man being precise about something that costs him something to be precise about. "Because it was easier to believe it than to fight through your father's door and find out I was wrong. And I have known that about myself, that I chose the easier thing for a long time." Vivienne looked at him. He looked back at her. He did not look away. He did not qualify it or diminish it or surround it with explanations that would make it more comfortable. He simply said the true thing and let it sit between them on the table with the letter. The room around them was doing its ordinary things, the fire, the other patrons. someone near the door with a loud opinion about the weather. None of it was relevant. "You came to Renfield," she said, "in April, 11 years ago." Something moved through his face. "Yes." "You sat on the wall." "For about an hour." A pause. "Mrs. Pierce." "Mrs. Pierce." "I saw you from the lane," he said. "Coming back from the hills. I recognized you immediately, which surprised me. I thought 10 years might." He stopped. "You looked well. You looked like yourself. You looked like someone who had built something they didn't need me disrupting." He looked at the table. "I thought if she wanted to be found, she would have been findable. I thought I had no right." He looked up. "I was wrong about that too." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "You had the right," she said. "We both had the right. That was what was taken from us." He looked at her. She looked back at him. 11 years. Two people in separate silences, each of them believing the other had chosen it. The truth of it was still very new, still raw in a way she could feel when she pressed against it. The sheer waste, the specific cruelty of it, the way it required her to reconstruct the entire story of the past decade with a different set of facts underneath. But she was 32 and she was sitting across from him, and she was not the girl in the vestibule anymore. She had not been that girl for a long time. And whatever came next, whatever she decided, she was going to decide it from here, from this woman she had become in the years when she thought she was only surviving. "I'm not going to make a decision tonight," she said. "I'm not asking you to. I need time." "Take it." "You'll—" She stopped. She had been about to ask if he would wait, and she caught herself on it, because it was a question with too much weight, a question that implied more than she was ready to imply. He seemed to understand this. He said, "I'll be here tomorrow and the day after for as long as you need. Not in the lane, not where you have to walk past me." A pause. "Just here, available." She looked at him. He looked like a man who had gotten very good at waiting. She stood up. "Good night," she said. "Good night, Vivienne." She walked to the door. She pushed it open. The October night was cold and complete and smelled of wood smoke and turned earth and the particular Shropshire dark that she had learned over the years to find genuinely beautiful. She crossed the lane and let herself into her cottage and stood in her kitchen in the dark for a moment, not lighting a lamp, just standing. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The letter was there. She left it there and went to bed. For the first time in 11 years, she fell asleep thinking about him deliberately, not guarding against it, not filing it away, simply letting herself think about the man in the corner table, and the garden in Surrey and the fireflies, and whatever came next. Whatever came next. She gave herself 3 days. This was a deliberate decision, made the morning after the public house with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything that mattered. Not one day was reactive, emotional, the product of a sleepless night and a letter read in lamplight. Not a week was avoidance dressed as patience, and she had spent enough of her life being patient with things that deserved a more direct response. 3 days, enough to think. Enough to feel, which was a different thing from thinking and required its own separate allocation of time. Enough to be certain that whatever she decided, she was deciding it rather than falling into it. She taught on the first day with the particular concentration of someone who is using their work as a container, pouring everything into the immediate, the present, the 14-year-old's algebra and the 7-year-old's reading voice, leaving no room for anything else until the room emptied and the quiet came back. Then she walked, longer than usual, up past the second hill to where the valley opened out below, and you could see the whole of Renfield from above, small and complete and entirely itself. She looked at it for a long time. She had arrived here at 23 with a box of letters she never read and a resolution she meant, and she had built in the years since something she had not entirely planned and was genuinely proud of. The school, Mrs. Pierce, the path up the hill that she knew by feel in the dark, Thomas Whitfield's confidence with numbers, Clara Baines reading aloud to children younger than herself with that improbable authority. These were real. These were hers. They did not become less real, because a man was sitting in the corner table of the public house 2 hills away. This was the first thing she needed to be certain of, and by the end of the first day she was. On the second day, she thought about Edmund. She did this properly, without the usual discipline of containment, sat with it, let it be full-sized, let herself look directly at the thing she had been filing and managing for 11 years. Not the Edmund of the vestibule and the note and the 9 years of silence, but the one before that. The one near the bookcase at the Hargroves, with the orchid cultivation book. The one who had said whatever makes you feel most like yourself, as though it were simply the most obvious criterion in the world. The one whose letters she still had in a box under her bed, unread for a decade, in handwriting she had recognized instantly on the outside of an envelope after 11 years. She thought about the man in the corner table, the way he had said I chose the easier thing without surrounding it with qualifications, the way he had said I'll be here without making it a demand. She thought about what it meant that she was thinking about these things, and she was honest with herself about what it meant, which was the hardest part. She was not the girl who had stood in the vestibule and believed, completely and without reservation, in the uncomplicated version of this. She was not capable of that anymore, and she did not want to be. What she had instead was more complicated and more durable, not the certainty of 22, but something harder one, something that knew the cost of things and chose them anyway. The question was whether she was willing to choose. She walked the second evening in a different direction than usual, along the river rather than up the hills, the water moving quickly in the cold with small decisive sounds. She walked until it was fully dark and then walked back by feel, which she could do, which she had learned to do, which was one of the things she knew about herself that she had not known at 22. She went to bed without a conclusion. This was, she decided, acceptable. Conclusions reached in the dark on the second day were probably not the kind that held. On the third morning, she woke before dawn. She lay in the dark and she was finished thinking. She had thought what there was to think and it had run its course, and what was left was not thought but something simpler and more fundamental. The knowledge that had been there, probably, since she opened the door of the public house and saw him at the corner table, which was that she was going to walk across the lane and knock on his door, and that she had always been going to do this, and that the 3 days had been necessary not to reach the decision, but to be certain it was hers. She rose. She washed. She made her tea and drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the lane go from black to gray to the thin early blue of an October dawn. Then she put on her coat and crossed the lane, and knocked on the door of the public house. Mr. Graves answered, in his dressing gown, with the expression of a man who has been in this business long enough to be unsurprised by anything, but still retains the right to an opinion about the hour. "Room at the top of the stairs," he said, before she could speak. She went up. She knocked. A pause long enough that she understood he had been asleep, which meant she had arrived before he had expected her, if he had expected her at all. Then footsteps. Then the door opened. He was not dressed. Shirt, no coat, hair not yet managed, the face of a man 2 minutes out of sleep who was working to process what he was looking at. He looked younger without the careful composure of the past week. He looked, in a way she had not seen since Surrey, like himself. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," she said. "Can I come in?" The room was small and cold, and the fire had gone out overnight. He rebuilt it while she sat in the one chair and watched him do it, which was an unexpectedly ordinary thing to watch. A man in his shirt sleeves rebuilding a fire in a small room in the early morning, while the October dawn came gray through the single window. When it caught, he sat on the edge of the bed across from her, at a distance that was careful and deliberate, and which she noticed. She had come with no plan. This was unusual for her, and she had done it purposefully, because plans were for things you could predict and she could not predict this and did not want to pretend otherwise. She said, "Tell me about the morning." He looked at her, "The 14th. From the beginning, from when you woke up." He told her. He told her about the 5 o'clock dark and the 4 hours of waiting and the maid at the door. He told her about his mother's room and the document, and his mother's voice saying the girl's father speaks for her in these matters. He told her about the carriage and the 40 minutes he could not account for and arriving at the church to find it emptying. He told her about the vestibule empty, the white roses. He told her about the carriage to her father's house and her father in the doorway, and the particular quality of the flatness in his voice, when he said, "She doesn't want to see you." He told her all of it. He did not edit it in his favor. He did not linger on his own suffering in ways designed to produce sympathy. He simply told her what happened in the sequence it happened, and where he had made the wrong choice he said so plainly, without the surrounding architecture of justification. She listened. She did not interrupt. She let it be full-sized, the whole shape of it, the morning and the document and the doorstep and the carriage and the 3 months in Northumberland and the 9 years, and Renfield in April with the hawthorn up and the hour on the wall. When he finished, they sat in silence for a while. The fire was going properly now. The room was warming in small increments. Outside the window the dawn was becoming actual morning, the gray going lighter, a bird starting somewhere in the hedges. "My father," she said finally. "Yes." "I don't," she stopped. She was finding the edges of something that was not grief exactly and not anger exactly, but had elements of both. "I don't know what to do with him in this. He's old and he's alone and he has lived with it, whatever it has cost him to live with it." She looked at the fire. "I'm not going to resolve that today." "You don't have to." "I'm not going to resolve a great many things today." "I know." She looked at him. "What do you want, Edmund?" It was the first time she had used his name. She heard it as she said it, heard what it meant, that it came out that naturally, without hesitation, the way a word comes when it has been part of your interior vocabulary for 11 years regardless of whether you have been using it aloud. He heard it too. She watched him hear it, the almost imperceptible change in his face, not triumph, nothing as aggressive as triumph, something quieter and more careful than that. He said, "I want to know you, the person you are now, not the one I knew at 21. I want to be in the same room as you without feeling like I'm trespassing." He paused. "I want to earn the right to the rest of it if there is a rest of it. I'm not presuming there is." "But you hope." "Yes, simply without qualification. I hope." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not leaving Renfield," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not disappointment, he was reading it correctly. She could see him reading it correctly. "I know. This is my life. The school, the village, Mrs. Pierce. This is what I built and I'm not dismantling it I'm not dismantling it." "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" He thought about it. She watched him think about it, which was one of the things she had forgotten. The way he actually thought before he spoke. The way most people only appeared to. "Letters," he said, "to start, if you're willing, and there are matters I could attend to from the north more easily than from London. I'm not suggesting," he stopped, reconsidered. "I'm suggesting that I would like to be less than a day's ride away. That is all I'm suggesting." Vivienne looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, with the patience of a man who had been practicing patience for 11 years and no longer needed to perform it. She thought about 22, the garden, the fireflies, the uncomplicated version of this. She thought about 32, the chair in this room, the fire she had watched him build, the conversation they had just had, which was more honest than any conversation she had managed in the last decade. She thought about the box under her bed, the letters she had kept and not read. She said, "There is a property north of here, About 6 miles. The Denmore estate, it's been empty for years. The family moved to Bath. I believe it's let." She paused. "The grounds are very fine. I've walked through them a number of times." He looked at her. "I'm telling you," she said carefully, "because it's the sort of information that might be useful to someone looking to be less than a day's ride from Renfield. I'm not telling you anything else." "I understand," he said. "Good." She stood up. He stood immediately, the reflex again, the lifelong habit, and then seemed uncertain what to do with himself standing, which she found, unexpectedly, almost amusing. "Vivienne," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, "for coming, for listening to all of it." She considered this. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I listened. That's all. We are at the beginning of something I haven't named and am not going to name yet, and I need you to understand that." "I understand that. You don't get to be certain about this." "I'm not certain about anything," he said. "I haven't been certain about anything since I was 28 and thought I was." She looked at him for a moment. Then she did something she had not planned and which surprised her. She held out her hand. Not the gesture of parting, not quite. Something older than that. The offer of a thing to be accepted deliberately, consciously, with full knowledge of what it did and did not mean. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He took her hand. His grip was careful. He held it for 3 seconds, she counted, which she found irritating and did anyway, and then released it. She went to the door. "Edmund," she said, with her hand on the latch. "Yes." "The Denmore estate." She did not turn around. "The caretaker is a Mr. Howell. He's very particular about the grounds. You would need to speak with him directly." A pause. "I'll bear that in mind," Edmund said. She opened the door and went downstairs and out into the Renfield morning, which was fully arrived now, pale and cold and completely ordinary. A Tuesday in October in a village in Shropshire. The lane empty except for Mrs. Pierce's cat crossing with its customary deliberateness from one side to the other. Vivienne stood on the lane for a moment. She breathed in the cold air. She looked at the school at the end of the lane. She looked at the hills above the valley going their impossible green against the gray sky. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The letter was still there. She left it there. She walked to school. He took the Denmore estate in November. She knew this because Mr. Howell told Mrs. Pierce, who told Vivienne on a Wednesday evening on the doorstep. In the same tone, she used to report on the weather or the state of the lane. Vivienne received this information, filed it, and went home to write a letter. Not a long one. She had decided early on that she was not going to perform this, not going to manufacture a version of it for the benefit of the narrative she could feel wanting to form around them. She wrote what she actually thought, which took some time, and sent what was true, which was shorter than she had expected. He wrote back within 3 days. His letters were, she had forgotten this, or perhaps she had chosen to forget it, or perhaps it simply hadn't been true at 28 in the way it was true now. His letters were good. Not good in the performed literary sense that some men's letters were, the carefully constructed impression of depth. Good in the way of a person who thought precisely and had something to say, and said it without the surrounding insulation of self-protection. She wrote back. He wrote back. The weeks went. November became December, cold and clear, the valley going frostwhite in the mornings. She taught. She walked. She had tea with Mrs. Pierce. She read his letters by the fire in the evenings and wrote back with a candor that surprised her slightly and then didn't, because this was what happened. She was learning when you stopped filing things. She did not see him for 6 weeks after the morning in the public house. When she did, it was accidental. She was coming back from a long Saturday walk, and he was on the lane in front of the public house with his horse and a general air of having arrived recently. He saw her at the same time she saw him. They both stopped. The moment held. Then she said, "You look cold." "It's very cold," he agreed. "Mrs. Haverstock makes a reasonable fire," she said, "if you wanted tea." He looked at her with an expression she had catalogued, years ago, as the one that meant he was genuinely pleased and trying not to show it too completely. "I'd like that," he said. They walked to Mrs. Haverstock's together, not touching, not talking much, the lane quiet around them and the frost beginning in the hedges. And it was ordinary, which was the thing she noticed most, the remarkable, almost shocking ordinariness of it. Two people walking down a lane in the late afternoon, their breath making small white clouds in the cold air. She had forgotten that it could be ordinary. She had forgotten, perhaps, that ordinary was what she had always wanted, not the spectacle of the Hargrove Ball or the Ashford townhouse or the church in Hanover Square, but this. A lane, an afternoon, a person beside you who knew what you thought and wanted to know more. She had built a great deal in 11 years. She was not going to dismantle any of it. But she thought, walking in the frost with her breath making clouds, that there might be room to build further. That was enough for now. That was, she decided, more than enough. 1 year later, the church in Renfield was not St. George's in Hanover Square. It had 12 pews, a fireplace that smoked in the east wind, and windows so old the glass had gone slightly wavy, the kind that made the world outside look like a painting that hadn't quite dried. The vicar was a young man named Mr. Dodd who had been in the village for 2 years and still occasionally looked surprised to find himself there. The flowers were not white roses. They were whatever Mrs. Pierce had found in her garden that morning, late autumn things, pale and small and slightly stubborn, which Vivienne found more appropriate than roses would have been. There were 14 guests. Mrs. Haverstock in the front pew, upright and pleased in the way of a woman whose opinion has been thoroughly vindicated. Mrs. Pierce beside her, in her good coat, watching everything with the calm interest of someone who had known how it was going to go and was satisfied to see it arrive. Thomas Whitfield and Clara Baines, who had been invited because Vivienne had decided that the people who mattered to her life should be present at the significant moments of it, regardless of what convention had to say about the guest list. A handful of Edmund's people, his secretary, an old friend from university, a cousin he actually liked, which narrowed the field considerably. No family on her side. She had written to her father in the spring. A short letter, not forgiving, not accusing, simply factual, the way she handled things she had not yet fully resolved. He had written back, shorter still, in the hand of a man who understood he had no right to more than she chose to give. She had filed it in the place she kept things that were ongoing rather than finished. That was where it stayed. She would attend to it eventually, in her own time, on her own terms. She was, she had decided, very good at her own terms. She dressed in Mrs. Haverstock's bedroom, which smelled of lavender and old wood, and the particular warmth of a house that has been properly lived in for many years. The dress was deep blue, not ivory, not white, not anything that rhymed with what had come before. She had chosen it specifically for this reason, and also because it was the color Edmund had mentioned once in a letter when describing the Northumberland sky on a clear morning, and she had thought, yes, that one. Polly was not here. Polly was in London, married now, with children Vivienne had not met. There was instead a girl from the village named Agnes who had clever hands and the good sense not to talk while she was using them. Agnes did her hair without speaking, which was exactly the right thing, and then stepped back and looked at her work with a professional satisfaction that required no commentary. Vivienne looked at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was 33. There were things in her face that had not been there at 22, not lines exactly, but a quality of settledness, of having arrived somewhere by a route that was longer than necessary and was hers nonetheless. She looked like a woman who had built something and knew it, who was choosing to build further from a position of genuine solidity rather than desperate hope. She looked, she thought, like herself. "Ready, miss," Agnes said, then caught herself. "Ma'am." Vivienne almost smiled. "Yes," she said, "thank you, Agnes." She walked to the church alone. This was her decision, made early and without discussion, because she was a woman who had spent 11 years walking places alone and saw no reason to require assistance for the last 100 yards of it. The November morning was cold and absolutely clear, the sky the particular hard blue of late autumn, the frost still on the hedges and the lane quiet and the village going about its ordinary business, with the complete indifference to significance that she had come to find genuinely comforting. Mrs. Pierce's cat crossed the lane in front of her. She stopped to let it pass. It glanced at her with the expression of a creature that has opinions about the timing of things but chooses not to share them, and then continued on its way. She walked to the church. He was outside. She had expected him to be inside, at the front, in the conventional position of a man waiting for a ceremony to begin. Instead, he was standing on the path outside the church door in his good coat, hat in his hands in the way she had catalogued, a year ago, as the gesture of a guilty man who didn't know what to do with his hands. He was not guilty now. He was simply standing there in the cold, watching her come down the lane. She stopped in front of him. "You're outside," she said. "I've been here since dawn," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't want to be late," he said. It landed exactly as it was meant to, not as a joke, not as a wound, but as the truth of what it was. A man who understood what had been lost and had decided, in every way available to him, not to lose it again. She felt it move through her, that understanding, clean and complete. "Edmund," she said. "Yes." "You've been standing outside in November since dawn." "It's a very fine morning." "It's extremely cold." "I hadn't noticed." She looked at him for a moment longer. His face was open in the way it went sometimes, when he had stopped managing it, the slightly unguarded expression she had catalogued years ago as the one that meant he was genuinely, entirely present. She held out her hand. He took it. Not the careful 3-second gesture of the public house. Something more settled than that, more certain, the grip of a man who has learned the cost of letting go and has no intention of repeating the lesson. She felt his hand warm around hers in the cold morning air and thought, briefly, of the garden in Surrey and the fireflies and the 22-year-old who had stood there with her hands shaking, and felt for her, across all that distance, something that was not quite pity and not quite pride but had elements of both. "You did well, asterisk," she thought to that girl. "You did better than well." "Shall we go in?" she said. "Yes," Edmund said, "let's." Mr. Dodd performed the ceremony with the slightly earnest precision of a young vicar who takes his responsibilities seriously and has perhaps rehearsed more than was strictly necessary. The 14 guests sat in the 12 pews with the comfortable informality of people who know each other or are willing to. Mrs. Pierce watched everything. Thomas Whitfield sat very straight, which was new, which made Vivienne think that someone had spoken to him about the occasion. Clara Baines had flowers in her hair that she had clearly arranged herself, and were extremely crooked and entirely perfect. The vows were the traditional ones. Vivienne had considered writing her own and decided against it. She was not, she had concluded, a woman who needed to make a speech at her own wedding. What she had to say to Edmund she had been saying for a year in letters and conversations and mornings on the lane, and what remained could be said later privately in the ordinary course of a shared life. When Mr. Dodd reached the relevant moment and Edmund said asterisk "I will," he said it in the same tone he used for everything he meant completely. Low, certain, the tone of a man stating a fact about the world rather than making a promise about the future. As though the thing were simply already true and he was confirming it for the record. She said "I will" asterisk in her own voice, steady and clear, and meant it in every direction, forward and backward, for the woman she was now and the girl she had been, for the life she had built and the life she was choosing to build further. Edmund's hand was warm around hers. Outside, through the wavy old glass of the Renfield church windows, the November morning went about its business. Frost on the hedges, the cat on its wall, the lane quiet and ordinary and entirely itself. Afterward, on the path outside, Mrs. Pierce took Vivienne's hand in her small, dry one and held it for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You took your time." "I did," Vivienne agreed. "Good," said Mrs. Pierce, with the satisfaction of a woman who has always believed that things worth having are worth the length of time it takes to be certain about them. She released Vivienne's hand and went to find her coat. Edmund appeared at Vivienne's side. "What did she say?" he asked. "That I took my time." "She's not wrong." "No," Vivienne said, "she never is." She looked at him standing in the November light in the village that was hers on the morning that was theirs, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something is built correctly. Not quickly, not easily, correctly. She had worn the dress twice. The first time, she had believed in the uncomplicated version of the story, the kind where the future arrives on schedule, and the morning goes as planned, and nothing costs more than you expected. The second time, she knew better. She knew what it cost, and what it was worth, and the difference between a promise made in a garden with fireflies and certainty, and a promise made in November with full knowledge of everything that could go wrong. The second kind she had come to understand was the one that held. She put her hand in Edmund's. They walked back down the lane together, into the ordinary morning, into the life that was waiting. Not the one she had imagined at 22, but the one she had built and chosen and earned. It was, she decided, considerably better. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. We always love seeing how many different places around the world are represented here, and reading your thoughts is one of the best parts of sharing these stories with you. Over time, this channel has grown into a wonderful community of listeners who enjoy historical drama, unforgettable characters, and stories filled with love, heartbreak, resilience, and second chances. Whether you've been with us from the beginning or this is the very first story you've heard on the channel, we're grateful that you chose to spend part of your day with us. We've now shared well over 100 stories together, and your support, comments, and encouragement have helped make that possible. Every kind message, every discussion in the comments, and every subscription helps this channel continue to grow. And if you'd like to support the channel even further, you can join as a member or send a super thanks or super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life and creating many more for you in the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.